really laid bare the direct line from residential segregation to unequal subprime lending to the very highly racialized foreclosure crisis and the massive destruction of wealth for Black and Latino families represented. I can't emphasize enough just how important this work is in terms of drawing attention to how contemporary forms of institutional and overt racism undermine homeownership of Black minors in the United States. Jacob's work also links housing wealth to political behavior, showing that the foreclosure crisis undermined Black voter turnout and documenting how the loss of housing wealth, coupled with deportation policies, shaped Latino voting and helped tilt election outcomes in Florida. More recently, he has turned his attention to how residential segregation and isolation have shaped white Americans' political attitudes and more importantly behavior, as we're about to hear about in just a moment. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rugh. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chenua, for that augmented bio and wonderful introduction. It's great to be here at Penn. Thank you to the library and Dawn for making everything go so smoothly. I'm grateful to be here and look forward to your feedback. I bring you greetings from Utah, where I'm not originally from. I'm from Chicago, but the fastest growing state that has swung left the most the last 20 years and is a really interesting place to be with all the transit growing up and the tech sector. Just seeing everything happen as a sociologist is a really fascinating window into the future. So thank you again for having me, and thanks again to Chenua. On January 6, 2021, a mob of nearly 9,000 people assembled outside the Capitol building of the United States. We know that over 3,200 people have been identified as breaching the Capitol, entering unlawfully, attacking officers outside. 140 law enforcement officers were injured. 7 people died directly from that day. There's been about 1,166 defendants charged so far. 92% of them are white American, and I'll say more about them in a minute. Over 800 more have been identified, and their names have been reported to the FBI. The statute of limitations on these federal criminal offenses will end in January 2026, 5 years later. So there's a race against the clock. We just completed the first 1,000 days since the attack. That was, I think on October 3rd, was 1,000 days, the first 1,000 days. So there's less than 1,000 to go, only about a couple more years here in January. And this is obviously the largest investigation of its kind, according to Attorney General Merrick Garland, and it's certainly strained resources and has stretched the FBI thin, this unprecedented prosecution of these rioters and insurrectionists. And we call it the insurrection because multiple federal judges have said it's an insurrection. The January 6th committee, bipartisan committee in the House of Representatives, has also deemed it to be an insurrection. And right now we know that in many states, Supreme Courts in Colorado and Minnesota are taking up the question of whether Trump is disqualified under the 14th Amendment to even be run for office again in those states. My father died of cancer just the month before the 2016 election, and he could barely sign his ballot, just marking an X for his signature. And in some ways, I'm glad he didn't live to see what happened after that. We know the very first lie that was told about the crowd size being bigger at the inauguration was, you could empirically demonstrate that was not true, but it was about power, and those lies obviously crescendoed with the lie about the 2020 election being stolen, which has been overturned in no fewer than 60 court cases as not true, the origin of this. All right, so let me keep going here. So a little bit about this data project. We have Isabella Feline, my collaborator, and I have spent over a couple years now every day checking to see more people arrested. We've read every page of every FBI criminal complaint. We've learned a lot about every one of these people. Their lives have been shattered in many ways. All of that data in the upper bullet points has all been cross-checked with all the other people doing the sleuthing and collecting the data. Down below are data that are unique to our data set. We have made sure to record how everybody traveled there, their party registration where the data is available, and also, especially at the bottom, a big contribution of our work in terms of demography and sociology is to understand, as sociologists do, what was the context, right? Their neighborhood context. And so we're the first analysis and database that we're aware of to geocode the residential locations of every January 6th defendant, except only one person we haven't been able to figure out, right? So every other person we have geocoded down to the census block group, census tract. We connect these data to John Logan and his colleagues, the longitudinal tract database, incredibly valuable resource to understand the neighborhood history of these defendants. And the next part that I want to talk about in a moment here is just reframing two social facts that have shaped my thinking going into this project: the social fact of residential segregation, as well as the myth of the coming white minority narrative. A little bit about these dots here. You can see that it is a function of population density in the United States, with some notable exceptions and fluctuations. Overrepresentation in Tampa Bay, no people from the Rio Grande Valley, nobody yet from the Hartford, Connecticut area. It's the only metro area with only over 1 million people with nobody. Nobody from San Francisco, which I know has fewer than 1 million people, but it's pretty close to 1 million people. So it is uneven. A lot more from Seattle for some reason, right? And almost all those people flew and took a lot of days off of work, which will relate to another paper idea that I'll talk about a little bit later. So the first reframing thinks about the idea, when we think about racial isolation, the fact that on average, right, white people are the most segregated people in America, living in neighborhoods that are still predominantly white. That has, of course, changed as the Latino and Asian population has increased, but we can see that, right, white-black integration on this measure, which is one of many measures, right, has been very slow, and only about 1 percentage point increase per decade. And we can see with the white population decreasing, this is basically stopped, the average white representation in the typical neighborhood of a black resident in the United States. And of course, in the green, we see there's been much more integration of black Americans with Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans, right, in terms of the data. But that's just one way of thinking about that. Again, up to date here with the latest data from Logan and Stoltz there. I thought a lot about these 3 quotes here, particularly as I read Mary Patillo's essay where she talked about, you know, integrating her high school and how that helped open up opportunities for her. And she is a proponent of integration, not of separatism. But she always wondered, well, how much did it really change the views of the white students? Because black students never became any more than 1% of her high school. And she worried that people will continue to conflate the idea of segregation with black people being a problem, black spaces being a problem. And I never stopped thinking about what she said and the conversations I've had with her, and the idea of Du Bois's rhetorical question, how does it feel to be a problem? And flipping this and thinking about the other side of this and what Dr. King had to say, and thinking about what does segregation do to white people? And of course, lots of other analysts have taken up this question. It's not a novel one. But as America becomes more diverse, that chasm between these all-white neighborhoods, and I picked 3 examples, all from the data set, right? These are not made up. These are all 3 defendants, their homes, and they're all in cities that are not that white, right? Thinking about what does it mean that chasm between an all-white place grows bigger as America becomes more diverse, right? That impact should be greater, that isolation is more severe. And another parallel with the physical racial isolation has to do with the online isolation and the community that extremists have found in platforms like Parler and Truth Social. And I was deeply impressed as I read this new article by Carol and colleagues in the ASR that came out right before I went to PAA. And they said, it's so interesting that these platforms that have a smaller fraction, I mean, you know, Facebook, Instagram are hundreds of millions of billions of people worldwide. these are so much smaller that their isolation really helps us understand these protest activity. And they showed that things like parlor videos are connected to racial supremacist and extremist protest activity in a very robust fashion, right? And so it's a little bit paradoxical that things that are a smaller number, that are more isolated, can have a bigger impact. But that's what they found in terms of the online aspect. And we know that this very small group, I mean, literally 10 in a million Americans, almost overturned democracy, almost overturned an election, was just down the hall from Senator Romney from the state where I live now, who's retiring. I read that piece in Atlantic where he's paying $5,000 a day for private security to protect him from voters in his own party, right? Another way of thinking about segregation that comes in a very, very simple but powerful framework is just thinking about the relationship with education as measured by college attainment, as well as black-white segregation. And every time I ran this, it's always about the segregation of white people from black people in particular. That's powerful. And voters in America had 2 chances to vote on Trump and Trumpism twice, right? They had 2016 and 2020. And when you combine those two, you can see it's very, very clear the relationship between education, and segregation, that both variables explain this spatial pattern of how counties voted at the county level. The second thing relates a little bit more directly to the conversation around the January 6th insurrection, and that is about the social fact of increasing diversity in America. We know that the Census Bureau, it's been, I think, over a decade now, no longer puts things like whites being a minority. They listen to Richard Alba and Dal Myers and others. But that framing endures and has been used to recruit extremists and supremacists. And it's not that I agree with Richard Alba on everything. I think I agree with him on most things, but I definitely agree with his point that it's very unlikely that there'll be a white minority anytime this century. That race is always reshaped and reformed historically. We can expect it to happen again. We just don't know exactly how it will happen, right? And I agree with that. And I think that racialized panic has been incredibly unfortunate, the way it has been politicized. And we had a conversation a little bit at dinner last night just about this, just all these different boxes that are multi-ethnic white or multiracial white, and that growing population of children that are multiracial is going to mix this up, right? Where the U.S. may move to be more like other countries, and it may not, right? Only the future will tell. But there has been a narrative that I'll say more about the attack that relates to this in just a minute. One thing that does relate to this is looking at the 51 Latino or Hispanic defendants so far. And you can see by the red bars that they are not representative of the Hispanic population. For one, are 94% men, which is an incredible gender composition. But they're in wider areas, right, with more white family members, such as parents. Also found that I'll show you in a minute about some other groups. But I just wanted to point this out first. 22% from Florida, which is higher, but it's really not. This is not explained by Cubans or some other explanation, but by this profile that you see here. So that's an idea that we have for another project that we can't fit into this paper, but that's okay. Because it took me 11 years to figure out you want to do multiple papers from one data set, but now I'm finally arriving at that idea now. This is just summarizing one slide as briefly as possible, just showing that the insurrectionists are disproportionately men, white men. They're 80% white men. They are higher income from higher income areas, and from our sample that we've looked at in terms of their occupation, owning small businesses, disproportionately higher income, but lower education, right? And Pape and his colleagues, when they did their analysis, they got the exact same figure, 25% with a college degree as we did. 7 times more likely to be in police, fire, private security, EMT. 11% veterans, which I looked up the data in the Census Bureau, is 11% among men age 18 to 64, so that's about the same. Similar home ownership, I'll get to that later. The same metropolitan, right? So this is not a disproportionately rural population. And this is the one that I'm most interested in, obviously, that the typical neighborhood that they live in is almost 20% more white. Looking at gender and race together, just the ratio of the number of people indicted of race, ethnicity, and gender to their population, to the adult population. The average is 4.5. Every group is below that, except for white men. It's an order of magnitude higher. There's still no black women that have been arrested or charged. There are a couple in the FBI picture database. One Native American man. You can see Hispanic men there, that huge gender disparity. Almost all of these, all of the Asian people that are Asian Americans and one Chinese national that have been charged, they're all Chinese and Vietnamese surnames. All of the black men that I found are somehow adjacent, married to somebody who's white, had a white girlfriend with somebody who's white, came with somebody who's white. There's a lot of white adjacency there. Those are obviously really small numbers, and this is what's driving it. So for this paper, we're going to focus on the nearly 1,100 white defendants, and just note that there's fewer than 100 of other races. So if you put them in, I mean, the trends are pretty much the same, right? Because it's being driven by this group right here. So our three research questions: how isolated are January 6th defendants racially? Has that changed more quickly? And I'll get to that in a moment. And does it matter? Is it statistically linked to sending a rider? So these are all the riders that come from neighborhoods that are at least 95% white. I mean, that's a lot. That's 1 in 5. That's more than twice the share of the census block groups. This is 2/3 of them are from what Peterson and Crevo and other researchers define as a predominantly white neighborhood, at least 70% white. So that's 2/3, right? Compared to 43% of the block groups. This is Pennsylvania, since I'm back in Pennsylvania. I thought I would show you this, just showing that 91% are in these predominantly white areas. Up there you can see, and the population of these counties is 70% white, right? These counties are not even as white as the state because they are the more populated counties. Erie being the only one with a population that doesn't have anybody yet. So you can see that quite clearly. 84 of the 86 from Pennsylvania are non-Hispanic white. I mean, which is, that's pretty stunning, right? And then this fills in the other dots, and you can see that right as you go more into the south and the west, where you have more racial representation in neighborhoods. But the story really comes out pretty clearly in these dots, that 85% of these defendants are from majority white, right, neighborhood spaces, okay? All right, so this is the part I've been hinting at and I want to get to. So there's been a lot that was reported in the first year or two as the first 700 or so defendants were reported on 2 reports that found, and it's true based on those, I'm not saying that anything was suspect, that they found that counties where the white population had declined more rapidly had higher odds of sending people to the capital. But again, Los Angeles County, Cook County, where I'm from, has 5 million people, right? A county is not a good definition of community or a local context in an urban sense. And again, these are 87% metropolitan. If they were all rural, I could accept a county as that, right? Most researchers do not posit a county as a community, right? It's just too big of a geographic container. So the first thing we want to know is, well, let's look up where everybody's from, which takes a lot of work, and geocode down to the tract and see if we get a different story. And so the big narrative comes from this idea that they're in places where the white population is decreasing more rapidly. The population on that map that I showed you where they're from, their home counties, is 2/3 of the population of America, right? And so these are going to be similar, right? Because it's 2/3 of America, but it's really not that different, right? So I don't see a big difference there, and I don't see a big story there, even though that's been a narrative that's prevailing thus far. What I see a much bigger story is not so much in that difference, but this one right here, right? between what is the context of their neighborhood where they live. And here we're looking at their census tracts. And you can see that in 1990, they were in census tracts, right, that were 15 percentage points more white. And that has only widened to 20 points, right? So again, by the end of this talk, hopefully you can hold together that riddle of two things are true at the same time. America is becoming more diverse. Their counties are no exception. In fact, they're not exceptional at all. Right? It's the same trend. That's true, right? And there is a racialized panic about that. At the same time, objectively, demographically speaking, it's objectively true that their neighborhoods are not changing that much. And they're still very predominantly white. This is an older group. Most protests and terrorist activity are almost always younger, right? The median age here is 39. The average age is 40. And so remember, a lot of these people have been shaped and formed, right, in these formative years back then when they were so white. So let me keep going with these contrasts here. Another way of thinking about it is that today their home tracts are still a little bit wider than their home counties were 30 years ago, right? So that they're maybe 30 years behind kind of what's happening or what's happened, right? There's an even bigger difference for homeowners, and I'll show you some more data on that in a minute. You can see that going from 18 to 24 points, difference, kind of a vertical gap when you look at homeowners. And there's renters there. So you got 13, 14, or 15, right? The trend there. So that's all well and good, but that's all the population, that's all the tracts, that's all the block groups. And so now I want to be a little bit more precise and say, let's take advantage of the data. Let's look at when we know they moved into their home that decade and look at what the census data were. And let's just compare white people to white people too, right? Apples to apples. Let's make sure I'm being more precise here. So this is looking at the white isolation. So that's the average percentage neighborhood white, right? An average white resident in these metro areas. And then this is looking at precisely how long they lived, right? In that experience to kind of get a gauge of that lived experience. You can see a similar story that the gap, of course, is smaller here when we're comparing white to white, but that it is in fact grown, right? By about 25% proportionally, right? From 6 to 8 points. So that's a good check, right? As I keep going in this exercise here. First cut of the data, just looking at this, right? Thinking about the idea that the isolation index best captures the experience of segregation. We can see this is about 0.4, right? So we're not publishing a paper based on this graph. This is just exploratory analysis. But it just shows that as white people are more isolated, there's more white defendants. Now again, when isolation is higher, that means there's just more white people. So the correlation between this and the white population is also about 0.5, okay? But it's not perfect, right? It's not just that there's more white people, it's that they're living with more white people and that they're more isolated, right? There's something about segregation. Even if you look at Florida and have no limitations, just every metro area, it explains a lot why Tampa, right, has way more people than Miami that were arrested. And this is the Florida map that shows you these huge clusters here, Tampa and some of these adjoining areas here in central Florida, right? And again, a huge racial disparity, right? 9 and 10 in a state like Florida where white people are only 1 and 2. All right, so now let's get into the formal analysis in the paper here. First thing to look at is just, let's look at the census tracts of the white defendants and then all the other tracts in the same counties where they're from. And here's are two things that we find. We find that in both types of tracts, the non-white population is growing similarly, right? So the same story in both types of tracts. The one thing that's very different is that the white population is growing 13 times as fast, right? So right, checkbox number 1 seems to be the opposite story that we've been told from some of these other reports, right? The white population is actually growing tremendously in these areas, right? And this comes from the work of Samuel Kai and his co-authors, this framework. I didn't have the chance to update these. These are really graphic intensive. They made the files too big to email these two things here, but they show with a really careful classification of white flight that avoids under and over classification, really quite clearly that among the white January 6th defendants, as you see up there, only 16% are living in these white flight tracts that are the gold circles here. Whereas when you look at all tracts, 28% are the white flight tracts in the green. And so that again is lower. It's less likely that they're living in areas with white flight with big racial change and turnover, right? The other thing from Kai's work is the flip side of this, and that's what he defines as white havens, and I don't have time to explain it all, but it's just the idea that there are neighborhoods that capture a disproportionate share of white growth. They become more white. The white population grows even as diversity grows in a metro area. And these white havens, you can see, are much more likely, all the conditions among the white defendants. So twice the share, right? 23% in white havens versus 11%. So that's also, again, meaningful that their segregation is being reproduced and reconcentrated, right? Even today. And these are going to be two variables that are going to be really important, right? The share that are white and the share that voted for Trump. And you can see that difference, right, in the neighborhoods where the white rioters are, the white havens, they're both substantial, right, as expected. And this one's actually just a little bit bigger than that one, which is important because common sense, we all know that, right, there's going to be more people from places where more people voted for Trump. This just shows Pennsylvania again, just to remind us when you look at these two variables. This is just looking at Beaver County on the border with Ohio and showing just how white those 5 census block groups are, where the 5 defendants are from that county. And this shows the Trump vote. And so they don't move. They're not linear with the relationship, but they are correlated, right? Where you can see the two things together. But what's really clear is that there's a much higher share in basically almost all white areas than there are in really heavily Trump areas, right? So what I'm trying to say is that their racial isolation, objectively speaking, is much greater than their political isolation, right? And so there's something about the role of race here that seems to be playing a bigger factor. All right, so just to remind us of the first 2 questions, I found showing you lots of different ways, including this one here, that yes, the white defendants are more isolated. And has their isolation fallen? No, clearly not. If anything, that difference has widened and opened up over time. So their isolation is starting to become a lot more stark contrast to what's going on around them. So now I want to get to this last part with the multivariate analysis to understand, well, does it matter, right? I mean, we showed a lot of things that are arithmetic with just subtraction and differences, but is that statistically significantly associated with the odds of a neighborhood sending a rioter to the Capitol, right? And so one of my favorite professors I've had, Jessica Trouncey, a mentor of mine, co-author on one paper, did a great job in this book just showing that so many factors, even the vote in 2008, was related to how white a neighborhood was in 1970, right? So that almost everything can trace back to kind of a earlier origin story of relative whiteness, public goods, partisanship, voting, lots of factors relate to how white is a census tract compared to its county or its metropolitan area. And so, I mean, the first thing that she talks about is, there's obviously, a hoarding perspective to this. It's not all of it, but it's part of it. And that part you can clearly see here that this paper is focused on the public peril of white isolation, the threat to democracy, but there's also a private gain side to this too, right? That these neighborhoods, the homes have appreciated, and Chenna's work and so many others have demonstrated this. I mean, they have more wealth and home equity to be able to, take time off to go storm the Capitol. This is a really obvious relationship here in the whiter areas on the right, especially the whitest area. So that we'll do in a separate paper here and just look at some of these things. More likely to fly, stronger relationship between distance and home equity for those who flew. And again, one of these homes in the data set is in Cook County, in North Shore, Chicago. It's a $5 million home. I've never seen a home like it in my life. So those are outliers, right? But you have the whole spectrum. And on average here, right, we're seeing, right, $358,000 in home equity. All right, so now I want to introduce this really important variable for the multivariate analysis, and that relates to a lot of what we've been talking about, the relationship between the census tract, how white it is, and the county, how white the county is. And I wanted to use where Trump is from in Jamaica Estates and Queens to illustrate this example of his growing up. His family moved into his home when he was 4 years old, and this is where he was raised. And you can see that in these three censuses, right, we're looking at 98 to 99 to 100% white, that census tract, right? And we can see that by the 1970s, right, as immigration, the Hart-Celler Act opens up immigration in the 60s, as Queens starts to change, and this is obviously by 2020 going to be down to 25% here, right, that divergence just opens up. And I just wanted to show you that's what relative whiteness means, right, that's 14 points more whiter, right? That's an example. And here is just somebody from 2 weeks ago who has a home that looks a lot like Trump's home, which is, of course, not intentional, but is a very powerful symbol of this. I mean, we don't know this, not intentional, but I'm assuming it's not intentional, right? So for the multivariate analysis, the outcome will be whether or not a census tract sent a white January 6th defendant. And we saw there were 1073 defendants, 975 tracts. So there's about 100 or so defendants that came with somebody else, right? It doesn't really matter how you cut that sandwich, it works out the same. These are the variables we're really interested in. How white is the tract compared to the county? We really want to make sure that how many people voted for Trump is our very important variable. And then we want to test the story of racial change. Is it that the white population is declining more? Is the decline in the white population driving people to go to the Capitol? We can test that. That's an empirical question. We can do it both ways. My preferred way at the tract level or the preferred way of the other narratives, right? That it's at the county level. We'll do it both ways. We'll look at both, right? And this just shows some of these differences here. Obviously, again, the racial difference being a little bit bigger than the political isolation and really not seeing a story here, right? Key control variables include these, especially from Carol's paper. And I went and had to collect this data myself again. It was really hard. All the metadata and all the part of the videos have a GPS coordinate. In fact, actually not all of them do. Some of them do and some don't. So this is kind of a tricky thing. And the rate there is about twice as high as the insurrection rate. Not quite twice as high, but almost. So this is another rare event, but also something that's in the data that's really important. How far away they are. I mean, yep. And then as you map everything and do this, I went to the FTA and found freeway and airport. And these two are going to be really important control variables that people don't go from far away without being close to a freeway or an airport, right? We see 99%. And again, most Americans live pretty close to a freeway or an airport, but this is, anyway, it's important to have this in here. It works better than any rural-urban continuum, rural thing. I've run all the other ones. This is the best one. Everything that's continuous is standardized to a mean of 0, standard deviation of 1. And here are the main results. You can see that both of these variables are very highly statistically significant by these z-stats in parentheses. You can see here that when you control for other factors, right, this is what you see, that how white a tract was 31 years earlier, right, before the insurrection, is going to be just as strong, almost a predictor, right? These are overlapping, obviously, right? These are going to be the two leading predictors of insurrection, right? Relative whiteness. When I put in the other story, racial change at the county level, this is what I see, right? This is not significant. The point estimate is very close to 1. It's not playing a big role here, right? And this is really important where our data set we leverage to really look at the tract level in comparison, right? And again, these are really important control variables, obviously, with regard to constraints and distance and so forth and so on. When you put in the tract change in white, this again makes sense to me, right? If there's going to be fewer white people declining over time, you're going to have fewer supply of insurrectionists who are mostly white. So I'm expecting that to be negative. And again, it's insignificant, right? It's not statistically significant at conventional levels. It's incredibly wide confidence interval here, right? Not a precise estimate. So again, at the tract level, same thing emerges, right? And in fact, this is the preferred specification here, where it's very clear to see that, right, how relatively white a tract is compared to its surrounding county and the Trump vote share. Those are the two big drivers. And when you put in Trump vote share, it doesn't knock out the white share, right? It's not that it's all through the Trump vote, right? There's something added to being racially isolated, right? That's kind of our main takeaway right here in this graph that I want to make sure we saw in in the biggest form possible here. I don't really want to talk about this in the Q&A, but I just want to show you one thing that relates to the sequel paper, and that's that when you're far away, it's driven more by that political ideology, isolation. Income's still not significant. We haven't done this for homeowners with home equity and so forth and so on, but we will. But when you're nearby up there, when you're within 400 miles, right, it's the whiteness thing that's the biggest point estimate, and the Trump vote share. This is an older run of the data. I think the Trump vote share will be significant again, but it's going to always be less than the whiteness. So there's something about when people were closer by that the segregation played a bigger role. When they're farther away, obviously they're going to be more self-selected and be people with resources and so forth and so on, right? So our results that we write in the paper, they really support a new, more accurate narrative, right? That it's not rising diversity, right? It's the ongoing segregation and isolation of white people that poses a greater threat to American democracy. And we think that that framing is so important that we don't accept the premise that's used to recruit extremists that diversity is the problem, that rising diversity is the threat, and then it caused people to come and overthrow democracy. Because really what we're seeing in the data is that diversity hasn't really risen that much, and that it's been slower to arrive where they live, and that gap has grown, so their isolation is more stark, right? And this is really interesting as it concerns our results, because it's not related change, right, in any way, shape, or form in any specification that we've run. And this racial panic, or the myth of the white minority, it may be more salient because these neighborhoods are so isolated and there's a lack of change. And Wendy and I were talking about the original racial threat literature, right? And a lot of this has to do with the threat of an impending, but not necessarily a personal experience, right, with racial contact, right? And so that's why it seems like that the offline physical racial isolation is tied to the online panic, because people don't have a way to kind of check or test that, right, in the real world. So this is where it ties into Kai's work, and especially Carol's ASR piece, right? These neighborhoods, white havens, really white areas, we all know and agree as demographers, they're decreasing in number. They're not as many areas, but it almost doesn't matter, right? And in fact, what's so interesting is that even if, or especially if they're dwindling in number, they pose a greater threat, because that experience diverges so much more from rising diversity and becomes much more of a contrast. And it becomes much more of a different world from what the rest of America is experiencing. And so this is something that has happened. It could happen again. It's happened at state capitol and other levels. It's something we have to be very vigilant and understand as demographers. Thank you. I did it in 38 minutes, I think, or 35. I invite any students or postdocs to ask first questions, but I know I'm going to talk to some students at lunch. But any questions, or any easy questions first, maybe? I'd just love to hear from you all what this clear correlation means, right? Between relative whiteness. Yeah, thank you.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm curious how you determined the race ethnicity, if you were able to use data to identify what they
Yes.
were?
Thank you for asking that. So in many states, we have their voter registration. We have the Bureau of Prisons data. We have the FBI filing for a minority response. We have that for a lot of people, though. We have their social media profiles, a lot of them sometimes say how they self-identify. And then we have just using 2 or 3 people to rate them on the ones where it's maybe a little bit more ambiguous. But yeah, this is mostly the idea of kind of street race or social race, right? How people are seen. But again, the voter registration one is a really good one where that's how when they sign up to vote, that's what they put. And that's for 15 states, including the big ones of New York and Florida are in that data. So yeah, I mean, that's going to get more interesting for the paper on the Hispanic defendants, because some of them you're going to have to say, well, their Hispanic surname, right? And they'll go back to the same thing in the 70s with the census had. Like we have these correlates, but we can't say what they say. But then we also have people that are Hispanic who have tons of social media saying Latinos for Trump, right? So they're pretty clear. They hold up that sign that they're identifying as Latino and for Trump. It's a great question. I think when we get to the Hispanic and to a lesser extent the Asian Americans, that will be a more important table to have, the methodology of how, and for how many people you have this information, how many people have that information. Yeah, does that answer the question? Yeah. And we looked at the other 1,200 that are identified and not arrested, and we coded all them based on, and we got the same like 93% white as we had 92% white here. So it's not as though somehow the people not arrested yet are going to be so different racially. Yeah, Amelia.
No, this is fascinating, and I mean, you gave us so many findings. I'm still trying to put my head around this.
I'm sorry, I know. I get so excited.
So I have a couple of questions. If you have this, just to get the message clear, what is it that separates the guy that went to Washington from the average Trump voter?
Trump voter.
I mean, you're basically you're saying that they're more isolated Trump voters, is it, or I'm trying to.
Yeah.
So that's my first question. My second question is the other story about this and whites and Trump and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Connects with declining opportunities in the area, stuff like that. So I was looking at your data and I was thinking, is there overall population decline? Is there absolute decline in white residents? But you say there's no.
Yeah, I'm finding the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah. So but what about? But is it because this is people are they are losing these terms, the mobile, are they losing social status because maybe these are people from urban areas, suburbanization.
Yeah.
But is there any? Can you get to this other question that these are people who are
with the social status question.
People say, oh, people we have forgotten about these poor workers or whatever, all that stuff that people say.
Yeah.
So can you get us some of that?
Yeah, we had that sample of men that lined up with all the other reports, and you do see some support for the hypothesis in terms of being very less educated, being small business owners. Certainly that profile, you could see that, right? But again, they tend to be higher income, right? Actually, owners of the business, quite a few businesses that they own, types of businesses, from gyms to real estate to construction to plumbing. I mean, lots of things. There is some support for that, right? But I think just demographically speaking, in terms of rates, right, there's just got to be enough white people for that correlation to be positive, right? And so the decline story doesn't ever come out in the data, right? But it's also true, the two things that's the thing about holding two things true at the same time, right? Their neighborhoods, right, are staying white, but it's also true that a lot of these metro areas have become less white, and there's that panic around that. But again, I do think there's a resource story here, and obviously a huge gender story, right? That men are just way more likely to go than women, right? And almost all of these women served in the military, were police, have a spouse that came with somebody else, right? They're always connected to that kind of masculine culture, almost all the women. So I do think that the data can answer that to some degree. I do think it's probably important to maybe control for some county things, but again, I've run county level models. I still haven't found support for some of those things, no matter how I run the data. But I'll think of some other variables. That's important to the other paper, I think. Yeah, I want to get these two comments. Yeah.
This isn't really a question so much
Yeah.
as just sort of thinking
Yeah.
your answer on the last question.
For sure.
Right? So in a sense, what you got here is a profile of the people who have the means to be able to go to protest. So you might not see the status decline with these people, but that doesn't mean that all the people who wanted to go to protest but
Exactly.
couldn't get off work don't have that status decline.
That's right.
So in some ways, they might be representing a larger population where status decline is going on. But these ones aren't personally affected by that because they can afford to fly to Washington, D.C.
Right.
and take
Take
4 days
off.
off work
Yeah.
and so on.
Yeah.
So they see themselves as part of a similar movement. So it doesn't mean that status decline isn't happening. It
Yeah.
just might not be happening.
Yeah. And we had the 9,000 people that are there, and if you look at all 9,000, you're going to get more of a spectrum, right? You might see. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Courtney.
thanks. This was a great, really interesting talk, and I love the idea of like a political demography. So I'm wondering, I think my question probably builds on Emilio's a little bit, about, as are these counties becoming increasingly selective in the sense that, or these tracts becoming increasingly selective, where, you see increasing diversity happening overall, a decline in the number of white havens, but them staying roughly, are they becoming more selective? And so the reason I was thinking about this was like, how are we thinking about the causal story? Are people moving to these counties? Like, where's the duration of exposure to these places? Like, are they people who are living in counties that were exposed or tracts that were increasingly diversified and moving into these white havens, or have they been there for long periods of time? And so just trying to think about even if it's it's all endogenous, that's still really important.
It still is.
People are selecting potentially into being in these places, or have they been there for a long time?
Yeah, it's a mix, right? Like most things, it's a continuum. And that's why these data, I think, are going to be really valuable. And if we ever got enough time in the team, then to collect all the residential tenure for the renters too, right? But right now, we've got it for all the homeowners. We know when they moved in, how long they've been there. And I think, if you were really serious and had all the power, you just do the life history of everybody. So just know what was their cumulative racial exposure for the whole lifetime from the time they were born. And it's amazing what you can do with public data now. You can almost get that for everybody, which is crazy to think that all of us, anybody, but it's a mix. And I see what you're saying. Like, so did they move to that area, right? And then they maintained it, or did it just kind of happen by inertia, right? Change or lack of change. And they were just there, right? Do you guys have more ideas on like how you would try to identify that with like there being like when they moved in before or after Trump in 2016? Because a lot of moves, people move pretty often. So a lot of these moves are in the last, 5 years or so. You could look at some of those breakpoints maybe to see. But it is interesting that when we looked at the tracks really quick, the tracks, one thing we did notice, right, is just that these are areas that are obviously growing more, right? And so what that tells you from Kai's work and others is that these are often metropolitan, but suburban at the fringe, right? So if anybody knows Tarrant County, Fort Worth, Texas, right? Northeast Tarrant has this whole reputation. Every time we post the maps for Texas, everybody comments on Northeast Tarrant County every time, Dallas, Fort Worth has like 30 people from the Metroplex, which is a lot. And there's only like 4 from Dallas or Fort Worth, right? So that's kind of what we're seeing. I think we're seeing a lot of this kind of being at the places where people are definitely moving to in the contemporary era, right? It's not just a story of like, oh, we had this house in the 60s or the 70s, right? There's a lot of moving to it, right? These places are growing and they're on the, not the fringe, but they're in the suburban outer regions, right? And that's why it was so tricky when they came out with all those first reports saying, oh, these are all from counties that voted for Biden and everything. It's like, well, what about their precincts, right? And the precincts are a lot more heavily for Trump. You got to look one layer down. So I'll have to think about that. But that's a really great thing to unpack next, right? And we have data that can help answer that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was also thinking about it in the context of like where people grew up. And again, this is like,
yes,
you would just
exactly.
You've done a tremendous data.
But you could do it maybe for the younger
work.
ones. Maybe for the ones that are younger, because we can just observe that since 1990, and we can kind of see that, and we could look at the younger ones. We could start with that at least. Yeah.
So yeah, I think you're right that these are the excerpts, right? When you look at, as a Philadelphia resident,
especially on the maps,
tracking, always Philadelphia gaining or losing population. It's always we celebrate any gain in population, but then if you compare the population growth in Philly to the excerpts, it's always off the charts. And those are the whiter. They're also a lot whiter.
Yeah.
So I think that you're right about the excerpts and looking for that. They're not rural, but they're
right.
Sort of far out suburban. But that's not what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you was, I've been thinking a lot during your whole talk about all the work done on racial resentment. So when you try to understand the rise of the far right voter and this white social movement, a lot of the literature that's come on racial
Yeah.
resentment, and so how do you see that fitting into this? So I think this is a fascinating
Yeah.
new demographic layer to this. But do you see this as, because I think everyone is right, you have to work really hard to find a 95% white neighborhood in these metropolitan areas.
Yeah.
And so,
It's amazing. There's so many. Yeah, the racial resentment literature is so rich, and it has all those data sets in political science to have that battery of questions. It's so many, including, I'm thinking like the CES that has 70,000 people with their zip code. I mean, you can get into some of that for white respondents, but I just think the level of geography here is just never going to match up well with those data sets. But clearly, that's a lot of what's going on here. I just think that literature, I could do a better job of building on that. I don't know how to do it in my analysis per se, but absolutely. I mean, people, we've just seen it in the data. Sorry, I'm getting stumped by your thing, but I'm not seeing how I can bring it in like at the track level. Yeah, I certainly know data sets with a zip code, right, with the CES. You could certainly look at that, and even with the CES, you could look at change over time as well. I mean, I only looked at Trump's share in 2020. You could look at that swing. You get 2 chances to vote for Trump, and it swung even more for Trump. That's the next thing I'm going to look at, and that'd be a better measure of like, okay, doubling down on this. Yeah. Masood.
Thank you, Jacob. This is wonderful. I wanted to echo the implication of your work for broader political sociology and literature. As we briefly spoke, there is increasing recognition that it's not economic hardship, it's threat to status.
Yep.
And what your work is showing is that it's not even threat to status, it's because of isolation. The demographic change hasn't, when you go down to neighborhood level, it hasn't changed much. So I think it has a lot of implications for political sociology and social movement literature. But I also wanted to say, beyond the voting variable that you have, is there any other measure of civic engagement? And I'm thinking about Putnam.
Yes, I've run that.
Yeah.
I've done the social capital index by county, the Putnam one and the one from the Joint Economic Committee from the Senate. I've run them both, and it doesn't emerge much. And sometimes the sign is opposite on those variables.
The reason I say this is because Gramsci's point that if you want to build a political movement, build the party of the church, right?
Yeah.
So it's just their religious
Yes.
and then
Yes.
that level of it.
And we look at the deep South. So South Carolina all the way through Louisiana, it's 100% white, which is incredible because that's such a diverse region. Those counties are 53% white, right? And I ran all the data on the ARDA religious congregation membership study, and it's not driven by that either. And I think that's just because of the distance and the resource story as well, but it's really not driven by the evangelical thing. And I can run that again and try to interact it in certain ways, but you're absolutely right that a lot of people, how do they learn that there's going to be a bus going to DC or they're all going to go together, right? That's through organizations. And it's so hard to track now all those flyers that went out saying, this GOP committee says occupy the Capitol. And I looked up some of that and tried to run that. And I'd really like, maybe there's somebody, maybe it doesn't have to be somebody here, but somebody who knows how to like scrape data and find that stuff. Because a lot of those Republican Facebook pages took that stuff down or it's not there anymore. But I think that Masood's right about there has to be some type of like institutional coalescence, right? That motivates enough people to actually make the trip, especially if you're not right within a day's drive, right? And that's why that one interests me the most, right? Like Seattle, and it's like everybody's from the Puget Sound area, and that's the highest home equity one too. They have like $800,000 in home equity, those people. And so there's something that happened there. You know what I mean? That doesn't happen randomly. It's not just, and so you're right that social capital, that's probably why we've seen the sign switch on that sometimes it's probably related to just more capacity to organize and come to the Capitol, right? Including volunteerism and religious worship, which is, disturbing, right? Absolutely true. It's interesting that in Utah, in Utah County where I'm from, which has grown the most of the fastest growing state, there's only one person indicted. And that person's actually from Chicago. They only lived in Utah for 3 years. There's none from those 2 college towns of Provo or Orem. It doesn't mean there might not be somebody who's arrested, but it's driven a lot in Utah by people down in St. George and in these rural areas. This is 4 dots overlaid. And one of these 4, that young man took his life, right? And he committed suicide. And we know because they filed the death report in the FBI filing that he took his life with a gun. And he came with his uncle, right? I mean, so there's a whole layer of tragedy to every number in this data set, right? I mean, that's getting to your point, right? He came because his uncle went and another person went, another person went. He didn't come on his own. And then he ended up taking his life. His uncle was the violent one with felony, and he was just the one just parading misdemeanor trespassing. So, I mean, 8 more people have died afterwards among the defendants. That 1% in the data right here, this is not people winning their cases. There's only been 1 acquittal, 1, right? It's 8 people have taken their lives, right? It's crazy. Yeah.
Thanks so much. This is really fascinating. Just to kind of throw another angle.
Yeah.
Have you thought about looking at states where there have been gerrymandering controversies, say in the last, 20, 30 years, and the whole sort of minoritarian electoral asymmetry in the United States, especially that, and whether there's a disproportionate number of people from areas that have been gerrymandered in one.
That's great. Yeah, we haven't run that yet, right? So, and we have the data by congressional district. So we map the tract on the congressional district, which you have to do at that crosswalk. And I want to do that. I'm glad you reminded me, because when you look at some of these patterns, even within Ohio and within states, it's uneven, and there's something going on there, right? We don't know the mechanism, but it's very uneven. And so I'd be curious in that, both within states and then across states, right? Like the ones that have it versus the ones that don't. But that's something we can do with our data, right? Because we have it at the tract level, and you know how these boundaries are. They're not based on counties. The congressional districts, they're all over the place. Yes?
Very fascinating research. I was curious, you mentioned that the neighborhoods that were very isolated were also in cities that were changing very rapidly. The number of non-white people were not very, at least a very was it, I'm just curious, is it just the numbers increasing? Because I'm thinking about the last 5 years, there has also been a lot of racial unrest. Is there any connection with the cities that had protests, riots, and white nationalist backlash? Like, is there a connection with not just the demographic changes, but also the political racial unrest?
Yeah, I haven't run that yet, but I should. I know Social Explorer has a data set. There's other ones too. And some are better than others, right? Like I know my local area and I know it's undercounted, for example, the racial process. But yeah, we should run that. We should run that and see, because so many people, what they said was, oh, people did this in 2020 and this is the same thing. And we're just getting back at them and Antifa and all that other stuff. It's like in the rhetoric, so it'd be important to look empirically. Yeah, I'll do that. I know Social Explorer has the data set, so I could probably just run that and add it and see, right? Yeah, I'd be curious to see how it relates. Yeah, and then I can let you know. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Hi,
Yeah.
thank you for this talk. You mentioned a couple of times pointing out that the writers are prominent.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the intersection of white isolation and maybe like quantities, violent nature of this unrest, and sort of like how you might think about ways to operationalize that in your data and sort of what the role is.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could. We ran once just a number, like the number of men employed in these things, and it was getting a little bit significant in some of the runs. I think you might have to look at little subsets and so on, but I think it's an important thing to think about, that if men in overrepresented in things like police and the military and other things, if they're on the color line and they've had negative experiences, cross-racial experiences, then that somehow it's the men that's being overrepresented on top of all the other reasons that men are overrepresented. I think there's a racial story there where it interacts. I'm not sure exactly how I would get at that. I know my co-author in her paper is starting to look at that. But yeah, that's something we need to think about if you're gonna think about that race-gender interaction, because it obviously is gendered, right? Why is it almost all men, right? Yeah, we need to be more curious, about why. Yeah, thank you so much. I know everybody has their deadline. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. I appreciate the feedback and the good questions.